Have you ever heard of an old man who shared dinner with Bigfoot in the middle of a snow-covered forest? Not hunted, not attacked, but raising a glass, in silence, like family. The truth is, Bigfoot isn't just a legend. They owed a debt to one human, and when that man neared the coldest winter of his life, they returned, not for revenge, but to honor a silent promise. I tracked down old files from Willow Gap, met the last witnesses alive. This story has never been told publicly, until now. In the next few minutes, you'll discover why a lonely woodworker was trusted like kin by a mythical species, how their silent presence alone made armed hunters drop their guns and run, and the moment they first, ever, shared a drink with a human. It began in 1987 during a deadly blizzard. Thayer Holt found a feverish young Bigfoot near death and nursed it back to life using his late wife's remedies. Years later, they saved him from a ravine, and decades after that, they still returned, not out of obligation, but because of a promise never spoken aloud. This isn't folklore. And if you skip this video, you'll miss the one moment where a creature of legend called a man family. The wind dragged its teeth across the ridge that night, dragging dry leaves and smoke and old memories through the folds of the Ouachita Mountains. It was late December, sometime in the final winter of the 1980s, and the woods outside Willow Gap were choked thick with fog. It wasn't just the usual mist that hugged the lowlands and spilled between the trees like milk. This was a kind of breathless silence, like the forest had swallowed a secret and didn't know what to do with it. Inside a lean-to cabin at the edge of a clearing, a dim orange light flickered against a window pane thick with frost. The floorboards creaked with every shift of the wind. A single man sat slouched in a worn-out armchair, legs spread, one hand on a chipped bottle of beer. His name was Thayer Holt, 72. Skin like dry pine bark, hair the color of ash. He wore an old flannel shirt and long underwear under his jeans, a red knitted scarf wrapped twice around his wrist. Not for warmth, but because it still smelled faintly of her. He hadn't spoken a full sentence aloud to another human being in over a year. June Lee had died 7 winters ago in a storm that never really left. Her voice still lived in the wood grain and her shadow moved somewhere behind the curtains. But mostly, it was just him now. Him and the wind and the coyotes that cried too long at night. And then he heard it. It was faint at first, like a moan caught between trees. Then it pitched, somewhere between a baby's cry and a guttural growl. Too human to ignore, too unnatural to dismiss. Thayer froze, bottle halfway to his lips, breath caught like a splinter in his chest. He stayed that way for a few heartbeats, ears straining against the walls, the ticking of the wood stove, the hollow suck of wind under the eaves. Then he stood, slow and heavy, as if the sound had pulled a cord in him he hadn't realized still worked. He reached for the lantern. The door groaned open into the night, spilling lamplight across the porch. The fog swallowed it fast. Snow had started falling, just a trace, like powdered sugar scattered by a careless hand. Thayer stepped down, boots crunching over frost-bitten pine needles, and followed the sound. Not fast, not reckless, just steady, like the weight of it pulled him by the ribs. Through the skeletal trees and past the half-frozen creek, the sound grew louder, clearer, a wet, raspy wheeze, followed by a soft, shuddering sob. Thayer's breath fogged in front of him. The flame in the lantern trembled, and then he saw it. At the base of an old oak, partially covered in lichen and sleet, something moved. Curled into a trembling heap beside the roots, it looked, at first, like a small bear cub, but the arms, the fingers, were too long. One foot twitched, and it was unmistakably humanoid. Coarse brown hair, soaked and matted to the skin, bare chest heaving shallowly, eyes swollen and barely open. Thayer knelt slowly, knees stiff. The thing didn't stir. He could hear it now. A rattling breath, labored and shallow, like it was trying to breathe through fire. Fever. The body burned hot even through the chill air. Then, in the fog behind him, something shifted. He turned, raising the lantern. At first, all he saw were trees. Then movement, slow, deliberate, like shadows untangling themselves from the trunks. A figure stepped halfway forward. Then another, and another. Not bears, not men, larger than either and upright. Their shapes blurred by mist, their eyes catching firelight just enough to shine. The tallest stood nearly 8 feet, its chest rising slow and deep. One had a broad scar across its shoulder. Another held the hand of a smaller one, but it was the one in front, the one who stepped out of the fog. Just enough for Thayer to see the curve of her shoulders, the glint of intelligent sorrow in her gaze. That took his breath. In her hand, loosely wrapped, was a bit of cloth. It looked old, familiar. No, not just familiar. It was red. Thayer looked down at his wrist. June's scarf. The same yarn. The same weave. The exact same thread she'd wrapped around his arm the night she died. Somehow, some way, this creature, this mother, had found the match. Or remembered. She moved closer. Not threatening, just quiet. Her arm extended, and she placed the small burning creature, her child, gently on the ground before Thayer, her eyes never leaving his. Then she stepped back. The others did too. Not into the dark, not all the way, just enough to become watchers. Still, waiting. The lantern flickered. Thayer knelt again, this time slower, gentler. He reached for the child. Its fingers twitched. Its lips cracked with fever. He hesitated, his hands trembling as they hovered above the creature's damp skin. He remembered. He remembered June screaming in the storm, her hands gripping her chest, the snow coming in sideways. He remembered not reaching her in time, not knowing what to do, not being able to save her. His throat closed up. But tonight, something else had been placed in his hands. "This ain't chance," he whispered to himself. As he lifted the child, it groaned faintly, but didn't resist. Its body folded into him, head resting weakly against his chest. He could feel the heat radiating off it, could smell the wildness and the sickness. But he didn't flinch, didn't back away. He held it like something holy, like something broken that could still be made whole. He looked up once more. The family was still there, watching, silent, not blinking. Thayer glanced at the scarf on his wrist, then back at the boy in his arms. "Pa'ai gui no gencho toi," he breathed. And with that, he turned toward the cabin, lantern swinging low beside his knee, and carried the fevered creature into the warmth. The forest didn't move, the snow whispered. But somewhere in the dark, the old circle of promises that had once been broken had begun to close again, and the woods, they held their breath once more. The fire inside the cabin crackled low, shadows dancing along the walls like old ghosts too tired to leave. Thayer sat hunched by the wood stove, cradling the strange child in a bundle of quilts. The fever had broken sometime just before dawn, but its body still trembled, chest rising in uneven pulls like it hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to keep living. He pressed the back of his hand gently to its brow, still warm, but not scalding anymore. The way the boy's skin felt against his palm, he didn't know if it was flesh or something older, something woven tighter by time and wildness. He hadn't slept, not a second, not because of fear. That part had passed the moment he felt the boy's weight settle against his ribs, the way his own heart had slowed in that hush of understanding. No, what kept him awake was memory. Memory that snuck in through the cracks of the night like a draft and curled in beside him. He hadn't let himself remember June this clearly in years. Her laugh, dry and sudden like leaves skipping across dirt. Her hands always busy, shelling beans, mending something, pressing gently over bruises he never saw her get. And her stubbornness. The way she believed in things that didn't make sense to anyone but her. She'd known. She'd seen something in those woods before, long ago, and never once called it monstrous. She'd called them lost. That's what she said when she came home bloodied one spring, a strange calm in her eyes and the scent of pine sap thick on her clothes. "They're not animals, Tay," she whispered that night as she cleaned her tools. "They're old, older than any of us, just scared." He'd scoffed back then, told her not to chase fairy tales. But that was June Lee. She always had her hands in places where most folks turned away. He rose stiffly now, bones creaking louder than the floorboards, and pulled her old notebook from the cabinet above the sink. The leather cover was soft with wear, corners darkened by use, pages filled with her looping cursive, pressed flowers, sketches of bark, recipes for teas and tinctures passed down from her grandmother. The kind you didn't find in books, the kind that came whispered from back porches and mountain kitchens. He flipped past the ones for burns, past the entry about yarrow and feverfew, until he found what he needed: willow bark. He filled the kettle with snowmelt water from the tin basin and set it atop the stove, ground the dried bark into the strainer, added a dollop of honey, sliced some dried plum he'd been saving. When the tea steeped, he poured it carefully into a small wooden cup. Then, slowly, he knelt beside the child again. The boy stirred, sniffed the cup, blinked once. Brown eyes, large, ringed with red, full of things Thayer couldn't name. He didn't speak, didn't cry, just held his gaze like he understood something about Thayer that even Thayer didn't. The boy took a sip. Outside, the morning light stayed gray. The forest looked like it hadn't decided to wake yet. Later, after the child had drifted into uneasy sleep near the fire, Thayer stepped onto the porch. The snow had stilled sometime during the night, and now it just clung soft to the tops of branches and the railing like lace. That's when he saw it. Tied carefully around the post, just beside the lantern hook, a branch of pine, its needles still green and fragrant despite the cold. And not just any knot. It was tied in a cross-stitch pattern. Crude, yes, but unmistakable. The same pattern June used when she mended the patriarch's shoulder all those years ago. He hadn't believed her at first. She'd come running home through the trees, breathless and bright-eyed, cradling a bloodied cloth in one arm and her medicine kit in the other. Said she'd found a creature tangled in barbed wire near the riverbank. Said its eyes weren't wild. Said it let her touch it. He remembered arguing. "June, you can't just go patching up things you don't understand." She didn't flinch, just wiped her hands on a rag and said, "If we wait until we understand every soul before we help them, no one will ever get saved." That night, he sat by the fire while she cleaned a deep wound on the shoulder of something too tall for their home, its head ducked low under the rafters. It didn't snarl, didn't try to run. It just watched her work, like it knew she wasn't afraid. She sewed it up with cross stitches, tight and neat, humming a lullaby her mother taught her. And then, come morning, it was gone. But it had taken a pair of boots she'd left on the porch, left a twist of roots and pine cones in their place. Now, looking at the knot tied on his railing, he knew this wasn't random. They remembered, and more than that, they understood. They knew June was gone. And somehow, they knew he was all that was left of her. Inside, the boy stirred again. Whimpered. Thayer stepped back in, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He moved to the cabinet and pulled out an old faded washcloth, wet it with warm water, wrung it out slow, then knelt beside the boy once more. He cleaned the grime gently from the child's cheeks, the corner of its mouth, combed his fingers through the tangles of hair with care. "Bram," he whispered without thinking. The word felt right. Not human, not wild, something in between, like the first light breaking through a foggy morning. The boy blinked, then gave the faintest huff, almost like a sigh. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the fire gave off a low, steady heat, Bram sat up on his own for the first time. Still weak, still trembling but alert. He didn't speak, but he watched everything. Eyes following the dancing flame, the shape of the cabin, the edges of the table, the steam rising from the fresh cup of tea. Then, without a sound, He reached out and touched the red scarf wrapped around Thayer's wrist. Just a finger. Just once. Then he let go. Later, Thayer sat by the fire, bottle in hand, took a sip, then placed it down. Bram scooted forward, sniffed the mouth of the bottle, then pulled back with a wrinkled nose. Instead, he crawled to the hearth and dipped a finger into the honey jar beside the stove. He licked it, eyes closed. Then, slowly, he tapped the wooden floor beside him. 3 soft knocks. Thayer blinked. Again, 3 knocks. Then silence, as if it meant something. He didn't know what, but it felt like a beginning. That night, as the wind rose again and the fog crept closer to the windows, Thayer sat in his chair. Bram curled in the quilts nearby, and outside, beyond the porch, the trees watched. They stood there just beyond the firelight, too still to be wind-blown, too silent to be forgotten. He didn't need to look to know they were there. He could feel them, waiting, and in that waiting, something old and unfinished stirred. Something reaching across years and pain and blood and bark. A promise, not yet fulfilled, but no longer forgotten. The days didn't so much pass as they softened. The forest bled into the cabin and the cabin bled into the forest. Like the two were slowly remembering they'd once been the same thing. Snow lingered along the tree line, melting just enough to show wet patches of black earth and flattened pine needles. Thayer took to moving slow, not out of weakness but in rhythm with the quiet around him. He spoke only when necessary, which wasn't often. And Bram, well, Bram didn't speak at all, but his presence filled the place like a heartbeat you didn't know you'd been missing. He healed quickly, faster than any human child Thayer had ever known. The fever faded by the 3rd morning. The shallow, wheezing breath turned deep and even. The boy's eyes brightened, began to follow light, shadow, Thayer's hands. And then, one morning just before dawn, he stood on his own 2 feet. Bare, silent, steady. He took 2 steps toward the front door, stood with his forehead against the glass, and watched the pale sun rise behind the skeleton trees. His back was thin, hair still matted in places, but there was a kind of grace in the way he held himself, like a deer just learning how not to be prey. Thayer stayed seated, watched him from the table, one hand around his coffee cup, the other resting on his knee. He didn't say a word. Later that day, he gave the boy a name. Bram, he said softly, when the boy sat cross-legged on the rug, tapping his fingers in some rhythm that didn't belong to this world. That's what I'll call you. Bram means morning, or something close enough. The boy looked up, didn't nod, didn't smile, just blinked once, then tapped the floor again, 3 times, then silence. From then on, every movement carried meaning. Bram tapped, knocked, scraped his fingers in small circles on wood, stone, sometimes even Thayer's boot. It was a kind of language, and though Thayer didn't understand the words, he understood the feeling behind them. There was intention. There was trust. He started leaving out bowls of honey and warm water with mint, and Bram took them, carefully, never greedy. He never touched the beer bottles, not once. He'd lift one occasionally, sniff the rim with a scrunched nose, then set it back down and reach for a wooden spoon dipped in honey. And that alone, strange as it was, told Thayer more than any words ever could. Outside, footprints began appearing. Not Bram's, larger, deeper, sometimes with smaller prints beside them. Always around the edge of the clearing, never close to the cabin, not exactly, but close enough to be known. Sometimes Thayer saw them at dusk, still wet in the fresh snow. Sometimes he felt them more than saw them. The way his gut tightened before he stepped outside, the way the wind quieted just long enough to hear branches move when they shouldn't have. He never chased them, never shined a light. They weren't intruders. They were family, sort of. He found himself talking again. Mostly to June, sometimes to Bram, when the boy sat on the porch beside him in the twilight, legs swinging just above the snow. Thayer would sip his beer. Bram would hold a warm cup of honey tea, and Thayer would say things he hadn't said in years. Remember that time the pipes burst in January, and we tried to patch them with chewing gum? He chuckled once, the sound cracking from disuse. We damn near flooded the whole place. He looked over. Bram tilted his head, listening, tapping a slow rhythm on the porch rail with the back of his nails. June used to say the woods had ears, Thayer said. I didn't believe her then. I do now. That night, he built something. A round table. Nothing fancy. Just old cedar planks sanded down and nailed into shape. 3 legs, then 4. Then he sat it out on the porch and looked at it for a long while. It felt right, though he couldn't explain why. The next morning, he built chairs. 1, then another, then 2 more. He spaced them around the table, equal distance like the compass points. One of the chairs he left empty, untouched, like it belonged to someone who wasn't quite ready to sit yet. Or someone long gone. When Bram came out and saw the table, he didn't speak. He never did. But he walked to it, laid both palms flat on the surface, and tapped out a strange, syncopated rhythm. It wasn't music, but it wasn't noise either. That evening, Thayer watched from the porch as shadows moved through the tree line. He didn't flinch, didn't stand. He just set out another cup of honey. The fire in the hearth burned low. Later that night, after Bram had fallen asleep by the stove, Thayer stepped outside for air. The stars were sharp, cutting through the sky like glass. His breath fogged in front of him. The table sat quiet in the moonlight, the chairs untouched, the snow brushed from the seats by wind or by something else. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his pocket knife. Then, with slow hands and a steady grip, he etched symbols into the wood. On one seat, he carved the shape of a curled oak leaf, rough but clear. On the next, 3 wave-like lines, like ripples across a lake. On the third, a crescent moon, deep and wide. And on the smallest chair, Bram's, he carved a single sprouting seed. A beginning. He didn't know why. Didn't need to. It was what the wood asked for. The next morning he awoke to find Bram at the table, tracing each symbol with one long finger. His eyes focused. No tapping this time. Just silence. Later that day, wind roared through the canyon pass to the east. It came down the ridge like a freight train, knocking branches loose, tearing through the grove like something alive. Thayer had gone out to check the chicken coop when the roof of the old woodshed buckled. He heard it crack, a low, wet sound, and turned just in time to see the ridge beam begin to fall. He didn't have time to think, didn't have time to move. But Bram did. The boy lunged from the porch, faster than Thayer thought possible, grabbed the edge of his coat and yanked, hard. They both tumbled into the snow as the beam crashed beside them, sending a cloud of dust and splinters into the air. For a second, everything went still. Then Thayer sat up, looked at the boy beside him. "Jesus," he muttered. Bram blinked once, then started brushing snow off his own knees, calm as ever. Thayer exhaled slow, heart still thundering. "You saved my damn life," he whispered. Bram didn't smile. Didn't need to. That night Thayer poured 2 drinks. 1 beer for himself, 1 mug of warm honey water for the boy. They sat at the table in the dark, firelight flickering across the railing, their breath rising in small clouds. In the woods, just past the line of pine, shadows watched. And for the first time they didn't fade. They held their ground, unmoving, as if waiting for something to happen. Thayer didn't move. Bram tapped once on the table, then again, then 3 more times, slower. Thayer looked down at the marks on the chairs. Something had changed. He didn't know what yet, but he could feel it. Just below the skin of the world, waiting. The fire had gone low by the time Thayer stepped back out onto the porch. The cold biting harder now, sharp in his lungs, dry in his throat. Snow hung heavy in the crooks of the trees, bending pine limbs like old men bowing their heads. The table sat where it always did, quiet, expectant, ringed by 4 chairs that creaked when the wind leaned just right. Bram was inside asleep near the hearth, a quilt tucked to his chin, his breath slow and even. But Thayer couldn't sleep. Not tonight. Not with the way the woods felt different. Not dangerous. Just watchful. Like something was being decided in the dark. He sat down slowly at the table, his joints stiff, his back sore from the fall 2 nights before. Still, he moved with purpose. Not out of habit, but reverence. He placed 2 mugs, one of beer, one of a warm water with honey, on the surface between them. Only one person was there, but the act mattered. The circle had begun to mean something, though he didn't fully understand what. He rubbed his hands together and leaned forward, his breath rising in faint clouds that drifted across the tabletop. Then he spoke, low, slow, like talking to someone who wasn't quite visible but was listening just the same. "I used to think the world ended when she died," he said. "Felt like the trees got quieter, like the birds moved on. I couldn't breathe right for a year after that. Not from grief. No, grief I could handle. It was the guilt." He looked down at his own hands. They shook, just a little. The kind of tremble age gives you when you're not looking. "I should have done more. Run faster, heard her fall, got the damn door open sooner." He let out a breath that hitched halfway out. "But I didn't. And that's what stuck. That's what stayed." He paused, listening to the wind rush through the gap in the trees like water over stone. He leaned back slowly and took a sip from the mug, then rested his arm on the edge of the chair beside him. "She believed in something out here. Something I thought was just loneliness turned into stories. But it wasn't, was it? She saw you all, and you saw her. That scarf." His voice caught again. "That scarf never left my wrist since the day she gave it to me. But you had the match. That means something. I don't know what yet, but it means something." Behind him, the door creaked open. He didn't turn. He felt the presence before he heard the bare feet pad across the floorboards. Bram. The boy slid into the chair across from him, eyes heavy with sleep but wide and alert all the same. He didn't speak, just wrapped his fingers around the warm mug and stared into it like it held the shape of some hidden answer. Then, with a quiet, thoughtful motion, he tapped the table. Once, twice. Pause. 3 times. Thayer nodded. "Yeah, I know. They sat like that a long while, talking without talking, letting the wind say what it needed to. Bram would tap, and Thayer would answer with silence or a word, or just the weight of his gaze. At some point, the fire inside the cabin guttered out, but neither of them moved. Something about the cold made the moment feel cleaner, stripped of everything but what was true. And then it happened. Movement at the tree line. Not fast, not loud, just there. A shape stepped forward. One Thayer recognized now without fear. Tall, broad. Shoulders that stooped just slightly, like someone used to carrying burdens no one else saw. The patriarch. Half a breath later, another form moved. Smaller, rounder at the shoulders. The matriarch. Behind them, 2 more. Narrower builds. Younger, but not children. Siblings, maybe. A family. The whole of them just barely visible beyond the line of snow-dusted pine. Watching, no weapons, no threat, just watching. Bram looked up, stilled. Thayer didn't speak. He simply reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the knife he always kept there, and began carving. Slowly, deliberately. The oak leaf had already been done. So had the wave, the moon, the seed. But now he carved a line beneath each, connecting them. One continuous thread. Then, when he was done, he looked up. And for the first time, the matriarch stepped forward. She moved with grace, her feet soundless over the snow. Her breath came in slow clouds, long fingers open at her sides. She stopped just short of the porch's edge, eyes locked not on Bram, but on Thayer. And then she did something he never expected. She reached out, placed one hand gently on the back of the empty chair beside him, the one with the oak leaf etched into the wood, and let it rest there. Not to sit, not yet, just to touch, just to show him, we see you, we hear you, we remember her. Thayer closed his eyes, his throat clenched. When he opened them again, she was already retreating into the woods. The others followed, slow and silent, shadows folding back into the dark like they'd never been there. But something had shifted. He felt it in his chest, in the stillness that followed. Not silence. No, silence was absence. This was presence, the kind that hangs in the air after a vow is made. The next day, Thayer sanded the table again, smoothed it until the symbols gleamed under lamplight. He polished the chairs, fixed a wobble in one leg. That afternoon, Bram helped carry wood, placing the logs just right in a half-moon around the fire pit Thayer had started rebuilding outside. The snow had melted slightly, enough to see the grass beneath it, damp and curled. They worked without words. That evening, when they sat at the table again, Thayer looked at the 4 seats, not empty anymore. Not quite. He poured the beer. Bram brought the honey. And for a long while, neither of them moved, because something was coming. Something unspoken, unseen, but not unexpected. Later that night, Thayer couldn't sleep. Not from worry, from knowing. He sat alone by the fire, scarf still wrapped at his wrist, staring into the orange flicker. The shadows moved across the ceiling like they had shape, like they were waiting for something more. He didn't know what, but he knew it was close. Out past the edge of the clearing, a shape passed between trees. It didn't stop, didn't come closer. Just walked slow along the ridge, a silhouette against the stars. Thayer didn't need to see it clearly to know who it was. The wind whispered across the snow, and somewhere inside him, a promise breathed. Not old, not broken, but new and whole. The snow had been falling for hours. Not a soft flurry like in the early months, but a sideways storm, driven by wind that screamed through the pines like something ancient had woken up angry. It hammered the roof and pelted the windows with such force the whole cabin seemed to flinch. The fire inside hissed against the draft, its light flickering in restless rhythms. Bram sat cross-legged near the hearth, arms wrapped tight around his knees, watching Thayer with wide, unsettled eyes. He didn't tap, he didn't move. He just watched. Thayer pulled on his boots with effort. Every joint in his body felt swollen, as if the storm had burrowed straight into his bones. He lit the lantern, adjusted the wick, and turned to Bram. Just need to grab more wood, that's all. Won't be long. Bram stood, walked to the door, and placed one hand flat against it. No words, just that quiet pressure. A warning, maybe. A knowing. I'll be fine, Thayer said, forcing a smile he didn't feel. I've walked this stretch in worse. He opened the door. Wind slammed into him like a freight train. Cold clawed up his spine and settled in his chest like frostbite waiting its turn. Still, he stepped out, pulling the scarf tighter around his neck. Snow whipped sideways, obscuring everything beyond 10 feet. He moved slow, one foot dragging after the other, guided by memory and stubbornness. The woodshed stood maybe 20 yards from the porch, tucked near the edge of a thicket where the wind broke slightly. The roof leaned under years of wear and snowpack, but it held. He yanked the door open, half froze his fingers stacking a load of logs into his arms, and turned back toward the cabin. He made it 6 steps before the ground vanished. It didn't give way so much as disappear, a slick patch of ice hidden beneath powder, just enough to send his foot sliding and his knees buckling. The lantern flew, logs scattered, and the Thayer fell hard, tumbling backward, down into a narrow crevice he hadn't seen in years. Not since the big storm of '82 had opened a split in the earth behind the tree line. He landed hard. Then silence, a deep kind of silence, the kind that fills your ears like pressure underwater. Pain bloomed across his back and shoulder, but he couldn't move. The wind above howled through the pines, but down here, it was like the world had forgotten to breathe. He tried to sit up, couldn't. Something sharp jabbed through his side when he twisted. Broken rib, maybe. Or worse. Snow filtered in overhead, pale against the black. The lantern lay broken somewhere near the rim. He was alone, except a sound. Distant, high-pitched, a cry. Bram. Thayer's eyes burned. He closed them, teeth clenched. "Damn it, old man," he whispered, the breath shaky. "You had one job." Then something moved above. A shadow cut across the snowlight. Then another. Not small, not human. The first shape dropped into view, not down the hole, just into the line of sight. A massive figure, broad at the shoulders, covered in wet dark fur matted with frost. Eyes like charcoal set in stone. Then a second form stepped beside it, slower, more graceful. Arms out, palms downward like she was measuring the air. The patriarch, the matriarch, and behind them, Bram. He must have followed their scent, or their voices, or something else neither man nor book had words for. Thayer could barely lift his head. "I'm here," he croaked. "Stupid bastard went and got stuck." The patriarch moved first. He crouched at the rim, scanned the pit. Then, without a sound, he climbed down. Not like a human would. He didn't stumble or slide. He moved with purpose, gripping the rocks like he knew them. Thayer blinked. The giant knelt beside him, reached out one hand, not rough, not hasty, and pressed it gently to Thayer's chest, just to feel him breathe. Thayer wanted to laugh, but the pain in his ribs said no. The matriarch followed next. She stayed at the top, arms spread wide against the wind, her hair and fur fluttering like flags in a forgotten war. The siblings stood behind her, not children, not adults. Somewhere between, their silhouettes twitching like muscle memory was kicking in. And Bram. He stood at the edge of the pit, his eyes never leaving Thayer. The patriarch shifted his weight, slid one arm under Thayer's back and the other beneath his knees. Thayer grunted, the movement sharp as lightning through his ribs, but he didn't scream. He hadn't been carried like that since June. The climb out wasn't fast, but it was smooth. Each step deliberate, each hold solid. Snow pelted them from all sides, but it didn't slow them down. When they reached the top, the matriarch leaned close, her face inches from Thayer's. And in that moment, through the haze of pain and cold, he saw it, the scar, running diagonal across her mate's shoulder, cross-stitched, rough but unmistakable. June's stitching. He knew it like he knew the lines on his own palms. She'd sewn that wound herself. He remembered the way she'd steadied her hand, whispered to the creature like it was just another patient, just another soul in need of mending. And here he was, carried by that same creature, back through snow, through dark, back home. Thayer didn't remember the walk, only the way the snow gave under the patriarch's feet, the way Bram ran ahead to throw open the cabin door, the heat that hit his face when they crossed the threshold. He was placed gently near the fire, a quilt pulled up to his chest, something sweet pressed to his lips. Honey, and then sleep took him, not the kind born of exhaustion, the kind that trusts. When he woke, it was morning. Pale light crept through the windows. Bram slept beside him, curled like a cat. The cabin was quiet, still, until he turned his head and saw it. On the table, a circle of rope. Not new, not frayed. Knotted in the same cross-stitch pattern June used to mend saddle straps and herb bundles. The same knot she taught him when they were first married. He reached out with a shaking hand and touched it. The fibers were warm, alive, a symbol, not just of memory, of acknowledgement, of something being passed forward. Not just care, but forgiveness. The fire popped softly behind him, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight in his chest pressing down. He just lay there, breathing, as outside, the storm began to slow. The frost hadn't melted for days, the kind that clung to everything like a second skin. Porch rails, axe handles, the hinges on the barn door. Even the wind had teeth now. It howled through the cracks in the cedar planks like something alive, something bitter. Thayer had taken to sitting by the fire longer than usual, not from pain anymore, but from a kind of waiting. Something in the air had shifted since the fall. The scar down his rib cage ached when the weather turned, but that wasn't what kept him sharp-eyed. It was the stillness outside. Too still. Bram had stopped tapping for 2 nights straight. He hadn't taken ill, hadn't pulled away. But the rhythm was gone, as if his body knew before his mind what was coming. Then came the boot prints. Thayer spotted them before sunrise, when he opened the front door to toss out dishwater and saw the snow press down along the trail. 3 sets, deep, wide apart. Men, full grown. He followed their path with his eyes all the way to the edge of the woods and saw where they'd lingered. Just inside the trees, not coming closer. Not yet. He shut the door. Didn't say a word. Just poured coffee, stirred in a spoonful of honey, and handed the cup to Bram without looking. The boy took it, still silent, still staring at the floor like he was trying to read something only he could see. Later that morning, Thayer went into the storage bin behind the cabin and pulled out the old shotgun. It hadn't been fired in years, but he cleaned it, checked the chamber, set it on the mantel. He didn't load it. Not yet. The snow kept falling. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the table, Bram across from him, both of them wrapped in flannel, lit by lamplight and the glow of the stove. The wind came hard from the north, pushing against the door like someone testing the hinges. Then, just past midnight, they came. Headlights cut through the trees. Not far, maybe 30 yards out. 3 beams, jittering over snow and bark. Voices echoed, low, joking, too loud for this kind of cold. The kind of voices that weren't afraid because they hadn't yet seen what fear looks like in the wild. Thayer stood. Bram didn't move. Outside, doors slammed. Crunching boots, laughter, then stillness. Thayer opened the door slow. Didn't step outside. Just stood there, scarf wrapped tight, breath curling like smoke into the freezing dark. 3 men, mid-30s, flannel jackets. One held a flashlight. The tallest held a rifle, the kind used for elk but pointed like it was ready for war. The third man had binoculars around his neck and a cigarette hanging from his lip. "You Thayer Holt?" one of them called out. Thayer didn't answer. "We heard stories," the man said again, stepping forward. "Said you've been keeping something out here. Something strange, big, crying like a kid in the woods at night. Said you've been leaving food out, making signals in the trees." Thayer stepped out onto the porch, slow. "You believe every story you hear?" he asked, voice low. "No, sir," the man said, flashing a grin that didn't touch his eyes. "But we don't ignore tracks either. We saw what's out here. We seen the prints. Big. Too big to be a bear. And if it ain't a bear..." He didn't finish. Just raised the rifle and pointed it, past Thayer, toward the window. Bram, still sitting, still silent, but now standing. Watching, Thayer stepped between the gun and the cabin. "You lower that weapon," he said, voice calm but firm. "Or what?" "You'll regret the answer." The man didn't laugh this time, didn't speak. The silence stretched, and then the trees moved. No footsteps, no rustling, just a presence. A ripple of weight and breath and time pressing in from the woods. Shadows that weren't just dark, but solid. Stepping forward. 5, 6, 7, more. They didn't roar, didn't charge. They just stepped out, slow, tall, steady, shoulders rising above the men's heads, eyes burning like coals. The rifle dipped. The man with the flashlight backed up. The third one, cigarette man, turned and bolted without a word. The others followed. The headlights vanished a minute later. Thayer stood still. The family didn't move. Then, from the back, the matriarch stepped forward. She didn't look at the retreating humans. She didn't look at Thayer. She looked at the chair, the empty one. Then she walked up the steps, one slow foot at a time, and placed her hand, again, on the back of the seat. But this time, she didn't leave. She sat. The creak of wood under her weight filled the air like a bell tolling in a church that hadn't been visited in decades. Bram sat beside her. Thayer lowered his hand. His heart was still racing. But it was full. The woods breathed again. Not loud, not quiet, just alive. And somewhere past the edge of the clearing, the night watched in silence, waiting for what came next. The snow had hardened into a thin, glassy crust by morning, crunching sharp under Thayer's boots as he stepped onto the porch. The cold wasn't biting anymore. It had settled into something deeper, a kind of quiet that wrapped around the trees and held its breath. The firewood pile was low, but the air didn't feel like rushing. He stood there for a long while, hands deep in his coat pockets, looking out past the table to the woods beyond. They weren't watching from the trees that day. Not because they were gone, because they didn't have to anymore. Bram sat cross-legged on the porch step, sketching lines in the frost with one long finger. Curves and marks, the same symbols Thayer had carved into the chairs. The oak leaf, the waves, the moon, the sprouting seed. But now Bram added another, a spiral, tight in the middle, like a knot untying itself. Thayer didn't ask what it meant. He just watched. Later that day, he brought out the carving knife again. Not the utility blade he used for bark or repairs, but June's knife. The one she kept wrapped in cloth in the old sewing box, handle worn smooth from years of shaping wooden dolls for neighbor kids, spoons for market, charms for the sick. He rolled the cloth open slowly, touched the hilt, and then, one by one, he carried the chairs down from the porch to the clearing. Not far, just past the fire pit. He set them in a circle like before, matriarchs to the left, patriarchs across, Bram's beside his. One seat left open, still. He didn't know for whom anymore, but it needed to stay empty for now. He started with the matriarch's chair, smoothed the wood, wiped the dust, then dug the knife into the back slat, not to erase the oak leaf, but to deepen it, make it seen, make it last. He did the same for the others. The waves, carved bold and wide. The moon, curved just right like it was rising over some distant ridge. And the sprouting seed, delicate, thin, almost trembling, like it might take root if you stared too long. When he was done, he sat down in his own seat, wiped sweat and frost from his brow, and poured 2 drinks. 1 mug of beer, 1 of warm honey water. Bram joined him minutes later, carrying a piece of pine bark marked with 3 new symbols, ones Thayer didn't know. The boy set it gently in the middle of the table, then tapped it 3 times and sat without a word. The sun sank fast that evening, a sharp red behind the trees, like blood soaked into cotton. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. When the fire was lit and the flames danced high, the clearing felt smaller somehow, tighter, like the woods were leaning in. And then they came, not all at once, just one figure first, tall, steady, familiar. The patriarch stepped out of the trees like he belonged to them, like the pines had opened a door just for him. He didn't pause at the edge. He walked straight to the chair with the waves, looked at it, then slowly sat. The wood groaned under his weight, but didn't break. His eyes locked with Thayer's across the table. There was no tension, no warning, just presence. Thayer lifted his mug. The patriarch mirrored him. They touched rims, no words, no sound. Just that. A second later, the matriarch stepped from the dark. She moved slower, her gait more deliberate, her hands loose at her sides. She walked to her chair, paused, and ran her fingers over the oak carving. Then she sat. Bram smiled. A small one, quiet. He reached out and placed a pine cone in front of her. She accepted it with a slight nod. Behind them, the siblings lingered. Not ready to sit, but not hiding either. One leaned against a tree. The other crouched low, arms wrapped around knees, watching the fire, like they were waiting for something, or guarding something. Thayer sat there, cup in hand, staring at the faces across from him. Not faces, exactly. More like stories carved into muscle and fur and time. The patriarch looked older now, not from age, but from weight. The matriarch's eyes gleamed like stones washed in river light. Bram tapped once on the table, then again. Thayer followed, and the circle held. Later that night, after the fire had burned low and Bram had gone inside, Thayer sat alone beside the patriarch. They didn't speak, didn't move, just breathed in the cold together. And after a while, the patriarch did something Thayer hadn't expected. He reached out and placed one massive hand on Thayer's shoulder. It didn't linger, it didn't press. Just a brief touch, solid, grounding, like saying, "We know." And then he stood, walked back into the woods. The matriarch followed, slow and steady, casting one glance back at the empty chair before disappearing. The siblings vanished without sound. Thayer stayed there until the sky shifted from black to slate. He didn't know why, but it felt like something had clicked into place. Not finished, just aligned. The next morning he sanded each chair again, oiled the carvings, then placed a small stone on each one. A token, maybe. A way of saying thank you without speaking. He left the empty chair untouched. For now, he poured himself a drink as the wind rustled the pines. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was waiting. He felt like he was preparing. The sky held no clouds that evening, just a dome of deep indigo stretching quiet above the Ouachita Ridge. And every star shone like it had waited all winter to speak. The air had a sharp edge to it, but the wind had finally calmed, like even it knew to stay still for what was coming. Thayer stood out on the porch with a blanket draped across his shoulders, boots crunching lightly against the frost-laced boards. In one hand he held a lantern. In the other, a folded paper napkin with a single candle, wax stiff and small, stuck through the middle of a cupcake he'd found in the freezer. June had made them, years ago. Chocolate, with no icing. He had no idea why he saved them. Maybe for a day like this. The table waited in the center of the clearing. The chairs all in place. The carvings sharp now, deepened and oiled, each one catching moonlight in its own way. 4 were already occupied. Bram sat straight-backed in his, a little taller now, still barefoot, but with more weight in his chest, more stillness in his face. The matriarch watched the fire, hands folded in her lap, her gaze as constant as the mountains themselves. The patriarch sat with his elbows on his knees, breathing slow and steady, shoulders squared like he was holding up the sky. One of the siblings leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping softly on the armrest. The other stood behind Bram, quiet and unreadable. There was no ceremony, no call to gather, but they came, from the trees, from the ridge, from shadows long and deep. More of them. Not dozens, not a crowd, but enough. Broad backs and long arms and eyes like polished stone. They didn't speak, didn't blink. They walked with the patience of old rivers and took places around the outer edge of the clearing. Standing, witnessing. Thayer walked slowly, the candle trembling in his hand, and placed the cupcake in the center of the table. No one reached for it. It wasn't meant to be eaten. It was a marker. A circle closed. He cleared his throat. 80, he said. No one responded. But something in the air shifted, like the trees had heard him, like the stars had leaned in closer. He sat down, poured a drink, mug of beer for himself, honey water for Bram. Then he reached into the pouch hanging from his coat and pulled out something wrapped in linen. A carved figurine, small, smooth. It looked like nothing and everything, broad-shouldered, hunched slightly, with one hand lifted toward the sky. June had made it from cherry wood the year before she died. Said it came to her in a dream. Said she was supposed to give it to someone, but never told him who. Old. Thayer placed it on the table. No one touched it, but all eyes lingered. The patriarch reached for his mug, held it steady. Thayer did the same. And for a moment, the world narrowed into one breath, one motion. The mugs touched. the sound soft but full. Then the matriarch raised hers. Bram followed. The siblings too. And slowly, silently, the others did the same. Those still standing in the tree line, those farther back, even the youngest among them, whose faces barely reached the shoulders of their elders. The fire cracked, and in that one single moment, every cup lifted. Thayer closed his eyes, didn't say a word, didn't have to. Bram reached forward, tapped the table once, then again, then a third time. 3 slow, firm beats, then silence. Thayer looked up. Every eye in that clearing was turned to the sky. He followed. The stars didn't move, but they burned with a kind of stillness he hadn't seen in years. Then came the moment he couldn't have imagined, not even in his loneliest, most open-hearted dreams. The patriarch stood, walked slowly to the center of the table, set down his mug, then reached forward and took Thayer's, not forcefully, not politely, like an old friend, like a brother, and he poured a measure of honey water into it, returned it, the exchange not symbolic, not ritual, but something beyond language. They drank, together, not as man and beast, not as stranger and protector, but as something else, as family. Later, as the fire dimmed and the stars grew sharper, Bram stood and stepped into the center of the circle. Not a boy now. Not quite. Not anymore. He turned once, slowly, met every gaze, then tapped his chest, then the table, then the empty chair. Then, without a word, he walked to Thayer's side. The patriarch nodded. The matriarch blinked slow, and the youngest among them stepped forward, a little one, barely up to Bram's ribs, hair silver in the firelight. He reached up and took Bram's hand, then sat in the empty chair, not scared, not curious. Home. Thayer didn't cry. He wanted to. But the feeling wasn't sadness. It was something larger, something like return. He stood slowly, joints aching, knees stiff, and looked around the circle, at those who'd once watched from the dark, now sitting in firelight like they'd never been anywhere else. He didn't speak, but he whispered something only the air could hear. Family ain't always blood. Sometimes it's a promise kept. Sometimes it's the silence between breaths. No one answered, but the wind curled soft around the fire pit, and far above, the stars flickered once, like a blink, like a nod. And the forest leaned in and listened. Sometimes the deepest bonds are not built with words, but with presence. Moments shared in silence, gestures unspoken, the steady rhythm of showing up day after day. Trust, once lost, takes time to grow back. But in the quiet corners of the world, where wind moves slow through pine and breath becomes part of the land, it can happen. Healing can happen. Not in grand declarations, but in the way someone waits, listens, forgives. This was never just a story about wilderness. It was about what it means to belong, to be seen, not for what the world says we are, but for who we are when everything else is stripped away. Age, grief, fear, difference. These things can feel like walls, but when we let ourselves look deeper, they become doorways. And sometimes, if we're lucky, those doorways lead to places we never thought we'd reach again. Forgiveness doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it shows up in the way someone sits beside you without needing to speak. In the way a gesture echoes something long gone, reminding you that nothing meaningful is ever truly lost. We carry those echoes in our hands, in the way we carve symbols into wood, into memory. And family isn't always built on blood. Sometimes it's chosen, earned, found in the least expected places. Sometimes it's the one who shares a cup with you at the end of a long winter, the one who lets you sit beside them even when they don't understand you, the one who stays. There's a quiet kind of love that lives in places untouched by maps, a sacred thread that ties souls together when no one else is watching. And in the stillness of those places, around firelight or under stars, a different kind of promise is made, one that doesn't need words, only presence. If this story found a home in you, if something in it reminded you of someone you miss or someone you've chosen, take a moment to let it settle. And if you feel moved, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt seen in a way you couldn't explain? Have you ever forgiven someone without saying a word? What does family mean to you now? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. We read everyone. And if this quiet journey meant something to you, consider subscribing to stay with us as we keep telling stories like this. Stories for the heart, for the soul, for the ones still listening after midnight. Thank you for being here. You're always welcome at the fire.